Well, it's almost over. That season that most of us dread. No, not bow season. Political season. A week from Tuesday, it'll all be over for about a year and a half. Maybe, if we're lucky. But for this year anyway, this election cycle, it will end. Many would say we've pretty much bottomed out as far as candidates this year for this particular election cycle, especially for the highest office in the land. Some, I know, are voting early. Not because they're so enthusiastic, they just want to get it over with. Others have informed me in some way or fashion they aren't going to vote. It's just not worth it. We're not going to do it. We're not going to dirty our hands, and so on and so forth. But you know, there's more at stake in this election than just who's going to be president for the next 4 years. There are other political offices on the ballot. There are ballot issues on the ballot. Unless the Supreme Court does more to remove more from the ballot and make it so that they don't count. But the Arkansas Supreme Court, I should say, not the U.S. Supreme Court. But anyway, that's sort of a thing. But the main issue that is at stake, though, in this election, as in every election, is, are we going to remain one nation under God, or are we going to go our own way? In recent history, it seems like we're pulling more and more toward the going our own way than we are remaining one nation under God. Since no one candidate is perfect, okay? There isn't, granted, this year they're a little further from perfect than normal. But since there is no one perfect candidate running, perhaps what we need to do is look at party platform to determine who we're going to vote for and vote on those grounds. That might help you with your vote. One thing that is not going to help you with your vote is me. I am not going to tell you who to vote for. I'm not going to tell you how you should vote on ballot issues and so forth. I'm just not going to do that, not because I'm afraid of some separation of church and state lawyer coming and griping at me or anything. No, that's not it at all. That's something you need to decide through your study. I would like to, though, to give you something to consider as you contemplate fulfillment of this civic duty. In the book of Judges, we are told that the Israelites were practicing what I like to call safe sin. We're told the same thing on two separate occasions in the book of Judges. In Judges chapter 17, verse 6, and in Judges chapter 21, verse 25, which is the last phrase in the book of Judges. We are told, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Some versions have that last part as everyone did as he saw fit. There were no moral absolutes. There were no moral authority to appeal to. Just everyone did what they thought was best. And if what I thought was best was different than what you thought was best, I did my thing, you did your thing, and that's the thing that it was. Well, let's talk for a few moments this morning about the nation of Israel. And using the book of Judges sort of as a platform, let's talk about Israel's cycle. Because see, in the book of Judges, the Israelites go through something of a very vicious cycle. They begin with everything's fine. They live at peace. Everything is going good. But then somebody somewhere would have their own idea. Their own, something they thought was right that maybe other people might have thought wasn't right, but that didn't matter. They had their own idea. And then they would start to sin. Most of the time that sin had to do with worshiping a different god, lowercase g God, that is. Maybe it was because they married some of the inhabitants of the land, or maybe they thought it was for political purposes, or for whatever reason they would begin worshiping Baal or other idols. It was always, though, one of those gods of the nations that they were supposed to have driven out completely with Joshua. I mean, God was fairly explicit about those instructions. Yet Israel sometimes didn't do everything that God commanded them to do. So as a result of that sin, they would be enslaved, or they would be oppressed, we might call it. God would send a nation against the Israelites. And that nation would enslave them, would oppress them, would put them in bondage, would take from them the Israelites without giving anything back. That was just the way that it would work. This was punishment for their idolatry. And, and this punishment would last any number of years. I mean, there was a wide variance of how long it took the Israelites to finally cry out to God. They would see the error of their idolatrous ways, and they would feel bad about their mistake, or maybe the thing was they felt bad about the consequences of their mistake. You know, sort of like, you're not really sorry that you did it, you're just sorry you got caught, sort of thing. And so they would cry out to God, and God would raise up a deliverer for them. And this deliverer would become their judge, would become their leader, or at least the leader of a part of the nation of Israel, the part that had been enslaved, until such time as the judge died. And they would live in peace until the judge's death. And then maybe a few years later, or a little longer than the judge's lifetime, but generally speaking, once the judge died, guess what? They started to sin again. And after they started to sin again, then they were oppressed, they were enslaved. And then when they were enslaved for a certain number of years, then they cried out to God. God would send a deliverer. They would live at peace until the deliverer died, and then they would sin again. And you see the vicious cycle that Israel went through. So what was Israel's problem? What was it that put them on what was it that put them on this track? This endless, it would seem, cycle. Well, some would say it was because they had no king. There was no definite leader of the people, no stability. And so because there was no centralized government, we might say, then no monarch leading the people, everyone was left to determine for themselves what was right and what was wrong. And that's how they got into trouble. They didn't have anybody telling them what was right and what was wrong. They didn't have a king. Well, in reality, Israel did have a king. Maybe you've heard of him. He's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He is Yahweh. He is Jehovah. He is God Almighty. Any of those names ring a bell? They had a king. He wasn't an earthly king, but he was king nonetheless. Well, Israel's got this problem. They're in this vicious cycle. And so Israel comes up with a solution. The solution to their problem is found in 1 Samuel chapter 8, where Israel asks for a king. Now notice why they asked for a king. It wasn't so that they would have some sense of stability in a centralized government, and you wouldn't have one tribe doing this while another tribe was doing that. It wasn't because, basically it was because they wanted to be like everybody else. Give us a king so we'll be like the nations around us. Well, Samuel, who is known as the last of the judges and the first of the prophets, doesn't like the idea. And he counsels them against the idea of appointing this king. Well, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 7, 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 7, God instructs Samuel to go ahead and give them a king. God tells Samuel, you need to be sure you warn them about what the king is going to do. Make certain that you tell them how bad it's going to be, the problems that having a king is going to create. Make sure you appoint as king the man that I choose. And then in verse 7 of 1 Samuel chapter 8, God tells Samuel something very telling. He tells Samuel that it wasn't that Israel was rejecting Samuel. Israel was rejecting God as its king. See, it wasn't just that the nation should have seen God as their king. God saw himself as Israel's king, and then Israel turned their back on God. Israel rejected God as king. Now, does the nation of Israel sound like any other nation you know of? To me, it sounds an awful lot like our own United States. I mean, we seem to be getting further and further from using the Bible as a guide in the decisions that we make. I mean, do you want to know why our country is in such dire straits, morally speaking? It's not guns. It's not TV or movie violence. It's not video game violence or the internet or music or any of those other popular things that we try to pass the buck as saying they're responsible. Those are merely symptoms of a deeper problem. The real problem is that we are in dire straits as a nation because we have taken God out of schools. We've taken God out of our public life. So let's talk for a moment about the nation of the USA. You see, because we have seemed to have rejected God. And when God is rejected, no moral authority exists. There's no moral authority. That opens up the idea and the way for everyone to do what is right in his or her own eyes. There's no moral authority that exists. Just everyone does what they please. This is the moral and ethical policy by an ever-increasing segment of our society. And it's a philosophy, a policy that is continually enforced by government pronouncements, the media, popular role models, stars of stage and screen, music artists and so forth that are big with people and all. They come out and they speak out about things, and people think, well, if I want to be cool, then I got to be like them. I got to take their approach. And they don't even consult and see what the Bible has to say. And all of these are prominently displayed for viewing. One columnist once wrote, and I believe got in some serious trouble for it, but they penned in an article, "Why do we pass laws to protect the egg of the bald eagle, yet declare open season on preborn babies?" Why does a country's government's judicial system forbid a display of the Ten Commandments or of a nativity scene on federal grounds, on the alleged, quote-unquote, constitutional grounds of separation of church and state, which isn't exactly constitutional grounds? Separation of church and state comes from a letter Thomas Jefferson wrote about the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment. But that clause exists not to keep religion out of government. It exists to keep government out of religion. The way it's applied today, though, is exactly the opposite. And, anyway, but that's another lesson for another time. But a judicial system that forbids displays of the Ten Commandments or of a nativity scene, yet all the while subsidizing the vulgar, blasphemous, sacrilegious, quote-unquote, art of those who would curse God to his face. Why does the media and certain political watchdog groups glorify homosexuality, perversion, and other illicit relationships and pass off the traditional family situation as obsolete? It doesn't work. It's not viable anymore. You want to go back to Leave It to Beaver and the Andy Griffith Show? I don't think I would mind. I mean, they never locked their doors. It was, they felt secure. They weren't ever threatened with their life or felt worried about their life. Not a bad way to live, I don't think. But again, I digress. Or media or political watchdog groups that scream loudly about censorship in defense of things like pornography and blasphemy and remain strangely silent about the most censored book in America, the Bible. Why does it seem that so many influential legislators say nothing is quote unquote wrong except what they determine or what they are told is racism, sexism, or some other type of ism? Why do they preach tolerance of other views so long as those views agree with their own? That's not really tolerance, is it? If you say, you're free to think what you want about this, but you better agree with me, otherwise you're not being tolerant. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. When God is rejected, there's no moral authority that exists. So everyone can go about doing and saying whatever they believe to be right. Also, when God is rejected, there is only moral inconsistency. Moral inconsistency. You see, we have rejected a standard of moral authority. In other words, we've done what Israel did. We rejected God as our king in favor of everyone doing what is right in their own eyes. But you know something? Morality cannot be defined by individual choice. Because if I say something is morally right and you say that same thing is morally wrong, who's going to make the determination if we don't have a standard of authority to make that determination? The concepts of ought and ought not have no meaning without consequences for their violation. A law is not a law if there is no punishment for violating it. Most of us are aware that out here on 412 in town, the speed limit is 45 miles an hour. Now, what would happen if on the outskirts of town, the city put up a sign that said, the speed limit in town is 45 miles an hour on Highway 412. However, we have determined that it's not in our best interest to have police monitoring the speed of vehicles on 412. So you are left to your own honor to not exceed 45 miles an hour on 412 when you're in town. How effective of a law would the speed limit be? You wouldn't have people, you'd have people going 412 miles an hour on 412, wouldn't you? Because a law doesn't make sense. A law is that doesn't have punishment for its violation is not a law. Nor are moral concepts valid without the expectation of punishment for violation. And moral chaos will continue to increase until society accepts a rational basis for consistent moral action. See, when God is rejected, no moral authority exists. When God is rejected, there is only moral inconsistency. And when God is rejected, we are concerned only with self and gratifying the desires of self, and with the least unpleasant results. You know, today's society encourages us to ask a couple of questions, one of which is, how can I get away with it? How can I do what I want to do, even if somebody else thinks that it's wrong, and get away with it? They want to commit the sin or do whatever they want to do and escape the consequences. Let me give you a couple of examples. Have a designated driver. Okay, that sounds a good thing, something we should all be in line with and everything. But the concept behind that idea is go ahead and drink all you want to. Get plastered if you want to. Just don't get behind the wheel of a car. Commit the sin, escape the consequences. Practice safe sin. Another idea, practice safe sex. Yield to your passions, but prevent undesired consequences. And if those undesired consequences so happen to you, well, we can take care of that too. No problem whatsoever. That's why some schools pass out contraceptives, because simply telling them and encouraging abstinence doesn't work. Oddly, abstinence, 100% of the time it's tried, is effective. Okay, that's kind of weird, isn't it? That we want these others that aren't 100% effective, but we're going to ignore the one that is 100% effective. Give the drug addict clean needles so that when they inject illegal drugs into their arm, at least they're being safe. Legalize prostitution to control it and to keep the girls and guys, I guess, happy and safe. And tax it. See, that seems to be the cure-all for anything immoral. Let's legalize it so we can tax it so the state can benefit from it. And that makes it all right, I guess. I don't know. Go ahead and do it. Just don't get caught. See just how fine of a tightrope line you can walk without falling off. And sadly, many Christians are buying into this idea. We want to know how close we can get to sin without actually technically stepping across that line. We know it's wrong to gossip. Gossiping is a sin, but what about just listening to it? If I just listen, if I don't talk about it, if I don't engage in the conversation, if I just listen, am I really guilty of gossiping? Well, funny thing is, if nobody listens to a gossip, they'll stop talking. Right? Or the question, well, we know that getting drunk is a sin, but what about social drinking? What about an occasional beer? What about having, this, that, the other, just, for job-related purposes after hours? How close can we get to that line without actually technically stepping across that line? How safe can we make our sin? Unbelief in God is at the heart of this messed up morality. That's why it's so sad that many Christians buy into this idea of sinning safely. Truth be told, the questions we need to be asking are not, how can I get away with it? The question is not, how can I escape the unpleasant consequences, or how far can I go? What we need to be asking is, how pure can I stay? What we need to be asking is this activity that is so enjoyable to so many people, is it worth my soul? Instead, we try to sin safely and not get caught. I believe I've told you the story about a lady who could no longer operate her own motor vehicle. And she was very well off, and so she decided she was going to hire somebody to drive her around, to be her chauffeur. And she narrowed the field down to 3 candidates. First one came in, and she had one question in the interview. She said, "Did you see that stone wall by my driveway?" "Yes, ma'am, I did." "How close can you get my car to that wall without damaging the wall or the car?" He said, "Well, I think I could get within 2 feet, no problem." She said, "Okay." The second interviewee came in, and she asked him the same question. How close can you get to that stone wall without damaging the wall or the car? He said, I can get you within 1 foot. She said, that's pretty good. She asked the third one in, asked him the same question. How close to that stone wall can you get my car without damaging the wall or the car? And he thought about it for a moment and he said, ma'am, I honestly don't know how close I could get to that wall with your car, but one thing's for sure, if you hire me as your driver, I'm going to stay as far away from that wall as possible. Guess who got the job? The third one. Why? Because he understood that it wasn't a question of how close is too close, it was how far away can you stay. You see, as Christians, we are members of the nation of Christ. For the believer, the situation is completely different. One who accepts the Bible as a revelation from God can know that all consequences of immoral actions are not temporal, immediate, or observable. For example, Paul, in Acts chapter 24, Paul's talking to Felix, the governor. And evidently Felix believed in the idea, you only go around once, so grab all the gusto that you can. Do any and everything necessary to get what you want. And don't let anyone or anything stand in your way. But Paul spoke to him about this dog ethic. He spoke to him about the value of righteousness and self-control, concepts that were totally foreign to Felix. If Paul had stopped there, just talking about righteousness and self-control, Felix could have retorted, what are you talking about, Paul? Seriously, get serious, Paul. I mean, you've practiced your righteousness and self-control, and who's on trial and who's the judge? Really? Come on, Paul, get serious about it. Figure this out. You've practiced your little righteousness, your self-control, and who's a prisoner and who's the governor? You're in jail, and I've gotten away with it. I've practiced safe sin, and I'm the governor. But Paul didn't stop there, did he? Oh no. Paul goes on to tell Felix about the judgment to come. He tells Felix, one day you're going to face judgment. And you know what Acts 24 verse 25 tells us? As he reasoned about righteousness and self-control in the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you. Reading between the lines, the judgment to come scared Felix to death. He didn't want to hear about it. He didn't want to talk about it. The reality of a judgment after death before a God who is both kind and severe, Romans 11:22, would cause anyone who is unprepared to tremble. There is a consequence of sin which cannot be escaped by the puny measures people take today to make sin safe. Another example is Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes. Solomon lived life to the fullest. Okay, he had wealth and wives to satisfy every desire. If he wanted something, he snapped his fingers and he got it. That was just the way Solomon got to live. Yet, you read through the book of Ecclesiastes, he tried everything under the sun and found absolutely no fulfillment. Yet Solomon had wisdom to conclude what he does in Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14. The end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. After having everything his heart desired and more, Solomon concludes that the most important thing that we can do in life is fear God and obey His commandments, because one day there is going to be a judgment. And at that judgment, nothing we have done is going to be hidden from the judge. Human wisdom affirms that it will not work to just tell young people, or to tell adults for that matter, that some actions and activities are just plain wrong and sinful. That's too simplistic, they'll argue. And Christians need to live in the real world. They need to live in the real world where everything is gray and nothing is black or white. What's scary is that they're right, probably. Just telling folks that something is wrong is not going to change their lives, and is not going to change their minds. But just suppose that young people and older people could see righteous role models living the abundant life. Just suppose that they could hear the name of God uttered frequently, but only with reverence and awe, and never in vain. Just suppose they could see the Bible elevated to a place of respect, even in classrooms, and treat it as the Word of God, which it is, 1 Thessalonians 2:13. Suppose that they were taught that sexual desires must be satisfied only in the realm of marriage between a man and a woman who love each other and who have promised before God to stay together until death separates them, i.e., not until something better comes along. Suppose they were taught that they were created in the image of a loving God, instead of just being a glorified monkey or a glorified piece of slime that somehow climbed up out of the ocean onto the beach and evolved into what we are today. Just suppose, we'd live in a different nation, wouldn't we? No, you can't just tell them to say no. They must be so trained that their moral conviction will be stronger than their fleshly passions. And here's the key here, we have to demonstrate it in our own lives. We can't tell them something is wrong and then do it ourselves. It just doesn't work that way. But once we start demonstrating it, then you'll see a difference. Several years back, I was talking with a fairly young mother. She had a daughter who was 8, 9 years old. And she was very worried about this daughter of hers reaching the age of bodily changes. Specifically as it relates to her daughter being promiscuous. This mother had been promiscuous when she was a young teen, and didn't want her daughter to follow in her footsteps and make the same mistakes that she had. But she didn't know what to do. She was thinking about having the birth control implant, that device surgically inserted under your arm that prevents pregnancy for up to 4 years. Having that implanted into her daughter when the time came. I advised her to take another route. I told her she needed to teach her daughter that sex is for marriage and should be saved until then. This mother told me I didn't know what I was talking about because I didn't have any kids, and at the time I didn't. I've got 2 daughters that I've adopted that philosophy with, and guess what? It seems to be working okay. But she didn't see this as practical. I don't know if she went through with her plan. She may have. But if she did, she sent a message to her daughter that says it's okay to practice safe sin. In this lesson, I've been using a false term. Have you figured out what that false term is? safe sin. Because you see, there is no such thing as safe sin. No matter how hard we try, we cannot escape the consequences. Romans 3:23 says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And Romans 6:23 says, the wages of sin is death. Pretty cut and dry. If we sin, we die. And all of us have sinned. But praise be to our God and Father that the last half of Romans 6:23 concludes, but the free gift of God is eternal life in Jesus Christ our Lord. Have you been trying to practice safe sin in your own life? Moses, way back Moses, Numbers 32:23, he warned the people of Israel, be sure your sin will find you out. There is no such thing as safe sin. We need to be aware of that. And we need to stop trying to practice safe sin. Because trying to practice it is going to lead to failure. Deciding that we can just do what we want to do and, well, if it's wrong, then I'll ask for forgiveness later, just doesn't work. Because we're not guaranteed there's going to be a later. If you've been waiting until later to make things right between you and God, I would urge you not to delay any longer. Maybe making things right between you and God is simply asking God in a private prayer where you're at to help you be more in tune with Him, to help you to stop trying to practice safe sin, to help you start living the type of life you know He wants you to. Maybe it involves publicly asking for the church to pray with you and to pray for you so that you can make your life right with God. Or maybe it involves you publicly confessing that you want Jesus to be your Lord by being immersed in the watery grave of baptism for the forgiveness of your sins. Whatever your need is, don't leave here still with that need. If we can help you in some way through a public response for things to be right between you and God, then won't you come to the front now as we stand and sing together.